Hi, I'm Nick Hilton of The Town That Knew Too Much, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Hey Kev, how are you?
Hello, I'm never better. And now the autumn's here, Wendy, we can embrace our inner goth with the gloomy weather, right?
Autumn weather makes it dark. Kevin's never better, but always goth. All right, so it doesn't really rhyme, but yes, it's that time of year.
It certainly is, and it's certainly a time of year not to attempt poetry, I would imagine. So
all the year is that for me, right? Did you ever imagine that we'd have a returning guest on MetaPod?
Yeah, I suppose, perhaps, not least because kind of behind the scenes, we've asked a few guests to come back, but maybe not within our first year. So lo and behold, we welcome back Nick Hilton.
Yeah, Nick was one of our first guests. We spoke to him last year, and yes, MetaPod is about a year old. We really enjoyed The Town That Didn't Stare, a documentary podcast that Nick created himself about the town of East Grinstead in England. So we asked him to come on the show, and luckily he agreed.
That's right. That was episode 4 of MetaPod. If anyone is interested to go and listen back to hear how we've all aged.
And that reminds me, we should really do a voice progression check soon. Remember when we talked to Avery Trufelman way back for episode 2? And we were all talking about how low a podcaster's voice goes over time. And yours, I believe, was on the verge of subterranean smooth.
Yes, well, alongside the deepness, or not, I still think I could certainly do with a few ums and ahs.
I think I'm MetaPod's worst ummer. Not sure if I've gone...
Did you say ummer? Right,
ummer.
okay.
Ummer.
Okay.
Yeah. So not sure if I've gone lower or not. But anyway, we can listen if Nick's voice has changed. And this time around, we talked to him about his new documentary podcast, The Town That Knew Too Much, which is focused on the town of Cheltenham. Cheltenham, did I say it right?
Just about.
Cheltenham in England.
Yeah. Right. In each series, Nick presents with intelligence and a touch of humour the unusual history and characteristics that have helped earn each town national or international notoriety. The first series highlighted East Grinstead's attractiveness to groups at the fringes of society.
And this new series, The Town That Knew Too Much, revolves around espionage, intelligence, and some of the characters that have lurked in the shadows of the upper middle class town of Cheltenham, home of Britain's intelligence and security agency, GCHQ.
Those who have listened to Nick's earlier work in The Town That Didn't Stare will recognise his skill for storytelling with a clever turn of phrase and the ability to connect a town story to big picture issues like the internet, privacy, communications and society.
Let's get into it then.
Start the tape.
Nick Hilton of The Town That Knew Too Much, welcome to MetaPod. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I should say welcome back, as you are a returning MetaPod guest. We're thrilled to have you back after talking to you last year about your first podcast in this series. That was The Town That Didn't Stare, about East Grinstead in England. And you've published a new series recently under the title The Town That Knew Too Much. And that focuses on a different town in England. Could you tell us, where is this town that knew too much? What goes on there? And what are the consequences of this town knowing too much?
So this is about the town of Cheltenham, which is a regency town in the Cotswolds. It's quite a lot bigger than East Grinstead. It's quite a lot more famous than East Grinstead. People think about it because it's where Mad King George III went to try and recuperate when he was ill with whatever mental illness and porphyria he was suffering from at the time. It's known for its kind of grand Regency architecture. It's sort of very associated with Jane Austen and kind of that era of British English culture, I should say, which has been memorialized in countless films and TV shows and books, etc. And so that's kind of what Cheltenham is. It's a quite a posh town. It's kind of a town that has a very middle class face, upper middle class face. But it's also home to GCHQ, which is the government communications headquarters. It is to English people what the NSA is to the Americans, and it's ever more important as the center of British spying, as kind of traditional espionage as done by James Bond and George Smiley becomes antiquated, and it's much more about intercepting emails and listening in on phone lines and all the various things that GCHQ as a signals intelligence agency is equipped to do. So that kind of is what I wanted to look at with this series in a similar way that the East Grinstead series looked at the kind of flip side of bougie little Sussex town and with all these weird religions. This is all about how this, all the pomp and ceremony of this Regency town is sort of subverted in this kind of seedy world of espionage.
What are the consequences of the town knowing too much?
Well, I mean, there's always good stories. When there are spies involved, there are always good stories. So this series sort of started in my mind when I heard about the story of Geoffrey Prime, who is not widely known in the kind of pantheon of British traitors. I mean, he's not Kim Philby or Anthony Blunt or whatever, but he's this kind of seedy cab driver who was arrested on child sex offences and then turned out to be a really important informant for the Soviets. This is at the start of the 1980s. And that kind of got me thinking about how, there's something about the lack of glamour in that story and the lack of public interest in it, the way it sort of faded out of public consciousness. I was just amazed that I didn't know this story because you've heard most of the stories that we kind of tell ourselves about spies. So that kind of got me thinking about the way that this town is actually full of people who have incredible access to other people's information, their data, and that you can walk around the supermarket and you can look at people and just be like, that person might well be listening into all sorts of fascinating things all around the world. They know so much, but it's all kind of shrouded in this middle class secrecy. And that's kind of what I wanted to explore. And I wanted to create a name that made it obviously a sequel to The Town That Didn't Stare. And The Town That Didn't Stare is not a name that I invented. It's a name that the town has had for decades. I had to invent one for Cheltenham, which used as close to the same format as possible. So I nabbed it from the film.
Can I ask you, Nick? I mean, with your first series, which was about East Grinstead, as you explained, a lot of the stories there are synonymous with the town, and I would imagine that people knew about Homer Scientology, the Druids, the guy from the war who did the amazing dressing of burns and operations on burns. But equally with your latest one in Cheltenham, are the people of Cheltenham aware of some of the tales that you bring out in this latest podcast as perhaps the fine folk of East Grinstead are about the mysteries about that town?
I think there are elements of it that are very well known. I think everyone in the town knew when the Edward Snowden leaks came out. I think that suddenly the world's eyes are on Cheltenham. And similarly with things like the Gareth Williams, the body in a bag spy case, that was a huge front page news story here. I think that there's a generation that will remember the Prime story, but it will be faded. And just generally, I think probably there's a mixture of these stories being, as with East Grinstead, there were, I mixed some stories in there that people didn't really know. And I think there's probably a balance here as well. I would guess that the Prime one, when I speak to people about it, younger people don't know it at all. And then people who were around at the start of the 80s remember it, but remember it in a very kind of distant way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I wonder whether, I don't want to keep on referring back to the first season, but I think there are some comparisons to be made in terms of not the podcast itself, but the relationship between the town and the stories. And I wonder whether there was a certain amount of pride about the people of East Grinstead and the various things that happen there. Is that the same for the people of Cheltenham? Are they proud that they have the big donuts there, which is the nickname for the GCHQ, and these slightly more tawdry stories that you talk about in the podcast?
I think that the people of East Grinstead are very proud of the Guinea Pig Club and McIndoe and the surgery. I think they are very not proud of the alt religion stuff, and particularly the Scientologists. With Cheltenham, I think Cheltenham has a very productive relationship with GCHQ. It's by far the largest employer in town. It's kind of it's kind of enabled Cheltenham to maintain its affluence, and I think because it employs lots of people who are like very middle class civil servants, and it's allowed the town to go on being what it was historically. So I think they have a pretty good relationship with it. The donut is quite discreet, it's not in your face. It's sort of on the way out of Cheltenham, and it's very kind of low rise. You would barely know it was there, except for from above. So I think that people in Cheltenham are very comfortable with the relationship with GCHQ, would be my guess. Certainly a lot more comfortable than the East Grinstead people are with the Scientologists. Lastly,
for me for a sec, I mean, does the town come out of this story positively or negatively, or is that too much of a flippant way of analysing it?
I don't know, to be honest. I think the town is less of a coherent character in this series than it was in the previous series.
Right.
So it's all about sort of what's behind people's curtains, this series. And so to some extent, it's kind of a salacious show because it is about the times when it's gone wrong, really, more than the times when it went right. But I don't think I think it's a show which you can probably tell that I really like the town. I really have a lot of time for it. And I think it's a great place to live, and it's a place with all this interesting stuff going on. And then, when the camera pulls back and it takes a more panoptic view of intelligence and espionage and the problems that come of that, and then I think it's much less about the town. So I would guess that I don't think anyone in Cheltenham would listen to the podcast and be angry about it. I probably mispronounced some place names or something. That's what the people in East Grinstead got angry about, was just mispronunciations. But other than that,
people haven't been writing into the local papers, angry of Bishop's Cleeve or something like that.
No, nothing as of yet.
Okay.
Last time we talked about your stamp on the podcast, and I think which you described as lighthearted, funny, and weird. And this is the town that didn't stare, England's Twin Peaks, I think you referred to it as. What would you say your stamp on this series is?
I tried to do this one exactly the same. I mean, I tried to make it the same thing. I tried to repeat the trick. I knew I had a problem because I didn't have as good a protagonist as I did in the first series. Because East Grinstead, I genuinely think that's an interesting story, and I had an interesting way into telling it. But I'd learned quite a lot from doing that. This podcast deals with darker themes, I think, generally throughout it. The Scientology stuff is quite dark. That's really the only point in the first series where I sort of just kind of left it to itself, because the story of the guinea pigs is very uplifting. This deals with things like sexual offences against children, deals with suicide, and obviously spying, spying. No one thinks of spying as anything other than a bit silly, but in reality, it's all sorts of complicated. So the challenge was I wanted to maintain the tone, which is slightly lighthearted, whimsical, tangential, but also manage to deal with difficult themes. It's difficult to talk about. It's a real, Gareth Williams, for instance, was a real person. He's got real relatives who still live. I believe they are making a more in-depth, proper true crime podcast about his life and death. I wanted to talk about it, but I wanted to do it in a way that was delicate but not out of place with the rest of the and I can't speak to whether I achieved that or not, but it's straddling that line constantly. That was the kind of biggest challenge in this one. You mentioned the audience engagement thing. I mean, was just a kind of complete novelty. I wanted to do that for some time. Thought, let's do a podcast that's actually a treasure hunt across the internet. That was my kind of idea a few years ago. And I just thought telling the story of Kit Williams was the opportunity to do it. And so I dialed up some puzzle builders that I know through a corporate client. I have a corporate client who's a software company called Softwire. And they had done as part of their kind of internal comms, we'd done some podcasts about these escape rooms they build and these puzzle hunts across London that these guys build. So I emailed them and said, I'm thinking of doing this. I know you guys weren't able to do your across London scavenger hunt this year for obvious reasons. Would you be interested in helping me out with this?" And they replied the next day being like, "Yeah, we've built some prototypes." And I mean, they're incredible. I mean, what they did was amazing. I don't know if you've seen the website that they've built, but obviously if you haven't solved the puzzle, you can't really unlock the full secrets of that website. But it's all much more skilled and technical than anything that I do. And it was kind of inspirational. I can't solve the puzzle. Well,
has the response been good so far?
Yeah, I think we've had 18 people complete the puzzle.
And there's still time, right?
And there's still a bit of time. I think I was going to cap it at 20 winners anyway. So I think we'll get to 20, and then people can solve the puzzle whenever they like. It will always be there, but I'm going to stop sending out prizes because I've got these. I'll show you on. This is completely useless podcasting, but we've got these kind of little golden wishing fish brooches.
Oh yeah, very nice.
Which we're going to send out to anyone who solves the puzzle. So there's a real. It's free to enter. There's a real prize and that sort of thing. But I had to cap it for cost and energy reasons. I capped it at 20. But we've had winners from the UK, from America, from Australia, frustratingly for postage reasons, Sweden. People have really done it. I mean, it can be done. I should reiterate for anyone listening who wants to give it a go, it can be done in an afternoon. It shouldn't be beyond anyone, really.
A slight tangent, Nick, if we can, but we are a podcast about podcasts, and I'm curious. Is there this kind of the way podcasts are developing? There are so many of them. There are so different types of genres being covered, but you're gamifying your podcast, to use that slightly jargony word. I mean, is that something that you see being taken up by others just because it adds a different element to the experience and it kind of puts you slightly in a more interesting category than another one?
I honestly don't know. I think that there are ways that you can establish an interactivity that are very important to a lot of podcasts. A lot of podcasts have a sort of mail-in section, or they will do, and it's a live element to just so that you can speak to your audience in a more communicative way. And obviously with documentaries, you don't really have that luxury. But I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of gamifying or anything like that. I was just thinking, I'm going to make this podcast about Masquerade, about Kit Williams, about the wishing fish clock anyway. Yeah. Wouldn't it also be fun to just build a puzzle into it? I mean, that was as complex a thought as I had there.
And you do mention your girlfriend a couple of times in this latest season. How did she get on with the game, if you're allowed to tell us?
I do not believe she even gave it a go. The game, no.
Gosh.
But she did speak to me the other day and be like, I could never believe that I would end up with someone who made a whole podcast about the wishing fish clock. Because she's actually from Cheltenham, and so she's grown up with this completely naff clock in the shopping centre that she's just like, it is so weird to me that I ended up with someone who really cared that much about the big fish clock.
Nick, you said that you tried to replicate The Town That Didn't Stare to a fair degree. I think I remember you saying that you made a lot of, or some very last minute changes before the last episode of the last series came out. Did you follow that same formula this time around? Or did you have a clear idea of where you wanted to end up, or did that evolve over the series?
No, I had a clearer idea of where I wanted to end up with this series, for sure. I think with the last series, I had 5 episodes planned out, and then I always knew I wanted to do a kind of synoptic episode at the end, wrap things up. Whereas this one, I kind of knew I was building ever towards the Snowden leaks. Because in a way, they're the sort of culmination of the biggest moment, the biggest point at which GCHQ explodes out of the glossy Cheltenham veneer. So I was always building to that moment, and I made the decision to have 7 episodes rather than 6 because I really wanted the fish clock episode to sit in the middle and have 3 episodes either side. That was why I split Prime over 2 episodes. Quite a lot to discuss there. But yeah, no, I was more organized, is the word I should say, in this series. I finished the final episode. I was all done and dusted about 4 or 5 days in advance of publishing it. Whereas with The Town That Didn't Stare, it was a matter of a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, just on the creation of it. Yes, you dealt with some things that were slightly sensitive in the first one, especially, we're just talking about Scientologists, and we got into that in our last interview about how kind of prickly they can be around when anyone does anything about them. But in this particular one, you're dealing with spy agencies, people that have either been accused of spying or their families are still alive. And you did deal with that quite sensitively in this particular season. But was it just more difficult to put together because the subject area is people have signed Official Secrets Act? They might not want to talk about something that, is, spy. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I mean, there's the problem with doing anything which is historical. The reality is that the sources for Prime just were quite hard to come by.
Yeah.
And yeah, speaking to anyone involved closely in the day-to-day operations of GCHQ is just, it was a sort of no-go, but also I wasn't really very interested in it. I mean, I put through a press request to do a visit and have a chat with their official spokesperson, but it was a very half-hearted way. I didn't really want to do it. I just felt like I was obligated to, because it's always more interesting to hear what people who can talk about it have to say than what they're going to say about themselves. In the same way that I actually, in the end, didn't interview the person who wrote the official authorized biography of GCHQ, because people I spoke to kept saying, "Oh, it's really sanitized, really whitewashed." So it just seemed easier to speak to people who are slightly more on the outside and were able to talk about what's going on. But I was also conscious of being quite equivocal about the goings on of GCHQ and security services, because I don't want it, because again, it's the town. A lot of people in the town work in and around GCHQ, and they probably have a very different. I'm always amazed by when I speak to people who do currently work there. They're very evangelical about how good an employer it is, how valuable the work is, and all of those things. In a way that you have these sort of dinner parties where you talk about the Snowden leaks, and everyone agrees that bulk collection is terrible, and the NSA are villains. That's kind of what my perception of it was. I knew that the town doesn't necessarily agree with that, so I wanted to kind of present that equivocism in the podcast. And so you have the kind of in the final episode, you have the competing voices of David Armand, who ran GCHQ in the 90s and who has just written a book about spying, and he very strongly thinks that the Snowden leaks were a bad thing. And then you have Alan Rusbridger, who was editor of The Guardian at the time of the leaks, and he's very strongly thinks it was a good thing. So I didn't set them up in a ding-dong, but I sort of present both views, and I give a kind of vague summary of my own opinions, and just kind of leave it there somewhere in the grounds of uncertainty.
So we've talked about the creation and how this kind of came together. We now want you to have some opinions and kind of tackle some of the big issues that have emerged from it. But first of all, I'm curious: is there anything that you learned that surprised you, or were you just like, okay, well, that's just the spying business. That's what kind of what happens.
Anything that I learned that surprised me? I don't know how to answer that.
The coconuts are hard to crack.
I didn't have to do it, because it was well, I had to saw it, but it was sort of pre-cracked and it made a completely useless sound.
While you're thinking of that, we should probably explain that there is the expensive sound effects department at Nick Hilton's production company here, i.e. himself, bought a coconut and to get the horse's hooves sound.
Prestbury, a village on the edge of Cheltenham, which has, to some extent, become subsumed into the larger town's boundary, is said to be the second most haunted village in England, just behind Pluckley in Kent, which reports 12 distinct ghosts that haunt its ominously named Screaming Wood. It is said that during the English Civil War, Roundheads camped nearby anticipated the arrival in town of a cavalier messenger, and so stretched a rope across the Burbage, the village's most ancient street, in order to unseat the rider from his horse. He was then summarily executed, and, in indignation at his fate, haunts the village. Residents frequently claim to hear the sound of galloping hooves or the tortured snorts of his loyal mount. The spectral hooves that you're currently hearing aren't actually made by a horse. They're made by 2 halves of a coconut. I was walking to Tesco to buy a coconut, which is botanically not a nut but a drupe, like a peach, when I spotted a pre-opened one in the gutter. To save myself however much a coconut costs, I picked it up, took it home and cut it in half with a handsaw, something which is much, much easier said than done, and which I'm playing now like castanets, to make you feel like you're there in the gloom of a chilly Pressbury evening as the spirit world makes its purgatorial presence known. Yeah. Okay. I've seen Monty Python, so I thought this must make a really convincing, but it didn't. I don't know how they did it. I think with all the spying stuff it's sort of kind of what I expected, to be honest. It didn't surprise me massively. I don't ever claim to be an investigative journalist, really. I will do the very basic minimum amount of stuff, and I was very keen to I did hire a kind of researcher to specifically to try and find out what happened to Geoffrey Prime after he's left Cheltenham. And that's kind of as close as I came to unearthing anything that was really outside of the public domain. But generally, I kind of try and synthesize a variety of sources. And that's why I kind of lean quite heavily on my interviewees to provide information. But it's not a very good answer. But I don't think I was massively surprised by any of the spying elements of it.
Maybe I could say something I was surprised about in listening that came out in the last episode of the podcast, which I think you pack quite a lot into. You go into the Edward Snowden whistleblowing scandal, and you place that story between two global crises, 9/11 and the COVID-19 pandemic. I was surprised, I think Kevin said he was as well, that the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook data harvesting scandal was not mentioned in this context. Was that a storyline that you considered including, or were there other storylines that you considered but left out?
Well, what you're describing is a writing quirk, because the latest edition in terms of the interviews that I conducted and the tangents that I wanted to include was this stuff about the development of the first vaccine, which at the end of the production process, I was like, oh God, I might as well do it. It's interesting, even if it's a bit, no one wants to hear about vaccines right now. Or any more about vaccines, I should say. Everyone's a bit sick of it. I sort of, because in the first podcast, even though it was made during the pandemic, I didn't mention the pandemic once, made a real conscious effort. This one, I kind of liberated myself of that constraint. And yeah, so I thought I'll do this vaccine thing. And then I had to kind of find a way of fudging it into the narrative. Honestly, I wrote that paragraph in which I situated it between two crises. That was just, I just sat down and wrote that. I don't think I thought about it too much. But I would say that would say that Cambridge Analytica is probably, to my mind, maybe a subsidiary crisis, or a crisis that exists within a context that had already been established by Snowden. I think that both involve the use of data and our understanding of how states and state actors and non-state actors can harness data. I think that Snowden probably gives us the framework to understand Cambridge Analytica, and perhaps Cambridge Analytica is then a case of more looking at the application of the data harnessing, which I guess then is probably people want to talk quite specifically about either Trump or Brexit or something, and it's not really a single coherent crisis. Some people, I guess, would loosely define it as the rise of populism, but I think it's very vague and probably doesn't make sense to a lot of countries who have experienced those things over the course of these 20 years that I'm looking at have experienced populism. It's not been a kind of linear thing, even though in the UK and the US it was happening in 2016. So I don't know. I personally don't think the Snowden leaks are that big a story, personally. I mean, I don't say that on my podcast because I want people to listen to it. I think it was a little bit of a nothing burger, as Chris Christie would say. But it really was a big deal, and it really did change the way people saw the world. But I think it fizzled out in a way that I suspect that COVID-19 will not.
Just on that then, you said it's not perhaps a bigger deal as others thought it was at the time. Is that because you've had the benefit of hindsight that you think it wasn't as big as perhaps others perceived it to be?
I think it looked like a really huge story, but unfortunately, as I do sort of touch upon it in the podcast, I think the average person on the street just didn't care that much about bulk collection and interception of communications. I think they thought it's only perverts and terrorists who this would be a problem for. And so I think it was just, it was one of those things that, because The Guardian and various other publications had invested a huge amount of time and money into the investigation, and because it was sensational. It stayed around for a long time, but I don't know that it has that much cut through. And I think maybe WikiLeaks had more cut through because there was something quite shocking about seeing, American drone strikes on civilians. I mean, that sort of footage is much more visceral. It hits you in the gut. Whereas a lot of the Snowden stuff was about a sort of theory of statehood and state responsibility that is quite abstract and quite hard for people to just generally get really energized about. And I also think that maybe we collectively came to a sort of compromise that basically re-established the status quo, but it allowed people now feel like, oh, well, Snowden couldn't happen again because we now know what's going on, without anything actually changing, which sort of grandfathers a sense of consent into what was going on, now that it's kind of part of legislators and part of modern life, if that all makes sense. I don't know. I don't have the answers.
Yeah, I mean, I find this very interesting, and it's not quite the phrase that we have here, Nick, which is it's tomorrow's chip wrapper paper. I don't think it was quite on that level where people would just forget it the day after. But I wondered whether it was a certain type of a Guardian reading, New York Times reading, kind of left of center, slightly concerned about human rights type group of people that were up in arms about it. And it just didn't piss off the rest of Middle England that perhaps people thought it might do. So it then lost its kind of luster as a story. Would that be fair, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I don't know. I just think that even if we look at what's going on today in terms of data collection by various, mainly big tech companies, I think that it's something that really energizes and vexes a number of people in the media, but just doesn't have that much cut through publicly. I think that's kind of why it's been so difficult to legislate or to regulate these industries, is because it's not a very pressing political concern. It's quite a big concern for people within that space. And I think people within the space maybe recognize it. For instance, I kind of conclude by the podcast, the last two kind of quotes I give to other people are to James Ball, the kind of who writes about the internet, and Alan Rusbridger, who's on Facebook's oversight committee. They recognize that this is going to be a really big issue in terms of how we go forward as a civilization living within the internet. But I just don't think the average person cares about it. And that's the kind of thing that's difficult to reconcile. I think it is complicated, it is technical, it is abstract, and it just doesn't impact people's day-to-day lives. And it doesn't involve, anyone starving or being murdered, or, the issues with it are quite subtle. And yeah, I mean, I don't know where big tech regulation goes from here.
And it is because it's technical and it's a fairly dry subject that the great unwashed, as it were, don't care. Because in theory, we want them to care, but they don't. They're quite happy to continue sharing pictures on social media and connecting with brands so that, that data flows that way and people can be targeted in certain kinds of way. Gets all us hot around the collar. But as you say, people don't care. And it's a worry, perhaps.
Well, I personally don't care particularly. So I'm obviously part of the great unwashed. So I'm certainly not. I certainly wouldn't look down on people for doing it, because I personally am not someone who's particularly vexed by privacy concerns with the internet. But I do recognise that it is a difficult issue, and that there is real kind of it is something that will only become much more pressing. Just as I kind of look at GCHQ and how GCHQ has only become more important, it's only become more relevant to our national security. I think this will only become a bigger issue, and it requires a reconciliation of political and social concerns that are maybe not moving in the same direction. Yeah.
Your two guests on that point in the podcast, I think they're describing quite opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, effective oversight and regulation, assumingly by institutions, and individual people, deciding they're not going to use WhatsApp anymore. I mean, those are pretty opposite thing. I mean, realistically, there must be something in the middle. I mean, what does a reckoning with the internet and privacy look like on practical terms?
I think not to get too specifically into a point raised in a podcast that potentially people haven't listened to, but I think the point about WhatsApp was that when WhatsApp announced it was changing some of its privacy choices, quite a substantial people left the app, more than I would expect as someone who cynically thinks that people don't care that much about privacy. The thing that being illustrated by that point is that maybe that people do care more than I think. And if 10% of people lose a service because of privacy changes, then that's probably unsustainable for that service. So people can talk with their feet. I think that the person making that point, James Ball, would also support regulation of big tech. I think I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would. I think he also supports kind of the regulation of the type that Alan Rusbridger goes on to talk about, which is I think a Senate oversight committee or something like that, which was put in place after Snowden. So I think those are reconcilable points. I think it requires both a government will to do something in terms of legislation, and probably it requires a more vociferous public support for that, because people, politicians don't act politically unless they think there's a political necessity to do it. And I think as we get further away from Snowden, the political necessity has gotten ever weaker. But we're we're always a month or two away from the next big data scandal. Even now as the UK kind of tosses and turns about whether to give up the GDPR regulations that were imposed. There's big political arguments about freedom of information requests in this country and access to data there. So, it's always there, and there will come a point where there'll be just a really huge scandal. It will turn out that some big tech company has, photos of all of us sleeping, and it will become really politically salient again, I'm sure.
And probably quite dull, because I don't think I'm very interesting to watch when I'm sleeping. But related question, I suppose, do you think, and it's always difficult to say, well, do you think society is X or Y? But do you think generally we are more forgiving of private companies and their use of data than we are governments and their use of data?
As James Ball says at the end of the podcast, the distinction is in this instance is relatively moot, because they work in tandem and they work together. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the average Briton and the average American probably thinks their state is a relatively positive actor on the world stage. I think probably you'd get more than 50% approval for the intentions of the state, and probably less than 50% approval for the intentions of Facebook or Google. So in that sense, I would guess. But then again, you would get an incredibly low rating for the intentions of Russia or China. So I think it depends on the state actor. We think that some state actors are extremely malign. We generally think that all tech companies, I think people generally think that all tech companies are roughly the same, especially the big tech companies. So yeah, I wouldn't know. But I think they are two halves of the same piece, because they are big tech is providing data to governments, and governments are providing the access to data for big tech.
Yeah, I mean, I've recently been watching this excellent Netflix series that's coming out to coincide with the 20th anniversary of 9/11. It's called 9/11 and the War on Terror. And it's not just about the attacks in New York, but it's talking about what happened afterwards. And there are elements of that story that either I was unaware of at the time, just because I was not following that particular part of the news, but they struck deals with, I can't remember the name of it was Operation something or other. And they struck deals with the, Verizon and the other US phone companies for wiretapping. And there was this internal kind of conflict, even within the Bush administration. There were people within the FBI, and the Attorney General, John Ashcroft at the time, was saying, this is illegal, what we're doing with tapping people's phones and things like that. And the government was saying, on the other hand, well, we're trying to root out the terrorists, to use some of the kind of terminology that Bush was. And that was all happening behind the scenes. And it's only 10, 15 years later, we're starting to learn that these, even within governments that you think are fairly coherent and coordinated in policy, are fighting about stuff like this. And I just wonder whether we still have faced that kind of within our own government here in the UK, and what's been going on more recently, the Trump era, whether there is still that alternate, internal conflicts going on, or whether there is a slightly straighter path with things now.
I mean, the NSA and GCHQ overreach doesn't happen without the war on terror. I mean, it doesn't happen without that necessitating in the minds of certain people in the Bush administration and later in the Obama administration. It's not a single administration issue. These things stretch across time. It doesn't. Some people have to believe that the rights of the individual have to be sacrificed for the security of the collective. I think people are probably continuing to have that debate now, and it's just every year there's another piece of way in which technology creates something that needs to be specifically legislated for, specifically regulated. And probably there are people right now being like, how can we, because our job is not to worry what the public think, that our job is to stop acts of terrorism or however these people think. They probably are having those conversations now, and I don't think it's a coherent policy thing. And I think that the idea that the ministry in this country, the Ministry of Defence and the security services and GCHQ and Downing Street are all absolutely on the same page is probably absolutely crazy. And I think that there are senior people in the security services who probably think that Boris Johnson doesn't have a clue what's needed for national security, and who probably don't wait on his every word, and vice versa. I think he will probably not take the advice of every Tom, Dick and Harry. So it's never going to be a coherent thing. And it's just a case of whether we, as a public, can give people the flexibility, or whether we to make decisions kind of on our behalf for national security service purposes. Or this is I'm talking about this much more seriously than I ever talked about it in the podcast. This is good because we like diving into some of the issues that perhaps aren't talked about in the podcast directly. But we will end on a lighter note if we can. Would you like to be a spy if you could restart your excellent podcasting career and move into the world of espionage? Is it something that you perhaps would be attracted to, do you think, Nick? I think I have burnt my bridges there, but but if I could go back, I think I'd be terrible. I think I'd be absolutely terrible. Obviously, in order to be a podcaster, or to be any sort of writer or whatever, you have to be sort of indiscreet, and I think firstly you require some technical skills. I mean, you have to be able to speak a language or be really good at maths, or you have to have something. I would offer absolutely nothing. I could maybe work in human resources, or they must have a press office.
Those coconut skills you learned, though.
Yeah, I don't know how I would bring those to as like a sort of decoy, just so that the enemies of the British state think the cavalry is coming when it's not actually. So no, I don't think I would be very good, but I think it's a fascinating job, and I would love to do it. It's the sort of thing. Well, I sort of say I would love to do it. I'm sure in day-to-day terms, it's also very boring, and there's a lot of paperwork and office politics, and someone leaves the microwave dirty. But yeah, it's definitely a lot more interesting and rewarding than being a podcaster. So.
Okay, yeah. I do have another question. I apologize, that wasn't the last one. So have you already set your sights on another town, perhaps not in England, that you would like to regale us with its weird and sordid and mysterious tales for the next year, maybe?
Well, I obviously teased the Cheltenham thing on the last episode.
You did, yeah.
I think I'm probably in a place now where I can't afford to do another one without making any money from it, or I will get off my accountant's Christmas card list. So I do have a town in the US that I'm interested in. I don't know if it would work in the same format, and I do kind of have a feeling that maybe an approach to a third season would actually be to take 6 towns and tell kind of one smaller story from their kind of underbelly, rather than trying to stretch it out. But at the moment, I'm probably going to sit back and think about what every time I try and think for a moment about being like, actually, Nick, just focus on your paid work. I get another idea. So I've got a sort of thing about cryptocurrency that I'm sort of thinking about, and then I'm sort of thinking about this anthology series. And so I don't know, probably I'll be back, but I cannot successfully tease a new town, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, when you can, please let us know, and we'll do our best to share it with our audience.
I'll send a voice note.
There's something new coming. So again, thank you so much, Nick Hilton, for joining us again to talk about your excellent podcast. We wish you all the best for the future, whatever town or subject that you pick. And thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Nick for returning to MetaPod to talk with us. We have a lot of respect for the thought and work that he has invested in the Town series, and we really enjoy talking to him.
And we may even have him back yet again when he turns his attention to another town for Series 3.
I hope so. For those of you on Twitter or Instagram, you can follow The Town That Knew Too Much at The Town Pod and read more about Nick and his other work in podcasting. He does more than just documentaries about English towns. There are links on the MetaPod webpage for this episode.
We keep to the small town theme in our next episode of MetaPod when we talk to the creators of West Cork. That's Jennifer Ford and Sam Bungay. West Cork has been referred to as the new serial, a masterpiece, and possibly the best ever true crime podcast. It explores the mysterious murder of a French woman at her holiday home in a remote area of Ireland back in 1996.
Like many true crime podcasts, the case remains unsolved. However, West Cork is unlike others because part of the story is told by the main suspect of the murder.
Yeah, Jennifer and Sam are a wife and husband team. In addition to West Cork for Audible, they produced an 8-part Spotify BBC studio series on the punk band The Clash, which was hosted by none other than Chuck D of Public Enemy.
Jennifer is an award-winning documentary television producer, and Sam is a journalist whose work has appeared in This American Life, The Guardian, and The Daily Beast. It's incredible work by two talented storytellers and a fascinating story.
So we hope you'll listen to our conversation with them. And MetaPod listeners, please send us your comments for the MetaPod mailbag. We're also interested to hear your ideas and suggestions for future episodes of the show. But I think that's all for now.
Okay, then we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.